This is basically a masterclass in screenwriting. Today, you'll hear from John Musker, the legendary director behind some of Disney's most iconic movies, including The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, The Great Mouse Detective, Hercules, Treasure Planet, The Princess and the Frog, and Moana. He'll reveal his unusual writing process with Ron Clements, how to make a character likable, why it's sometimes necessary to cut scenes, and how to bounce back from failure. And if you stick around until the end, he'll share some of the best tips on dialogue I've ever heard, and how he used the Fantasia approach in his short film I'm Hip. John, welcome to Write for Animation. It's amazing to have you here as a guest.
Thank you for having me, Pietro.
The first film I watched in the movie theater was Little Mermaid in Italy. It really made me fall in love with this wonderful craft, so this means so much to me. I absolutely love the metaphor that I've heard from you about a story being like a treehouse or a train, and I would love to hear a little bit about that.
I had heard that analogy from Joe Hale. Joe Hale was the producer of The Black Cauldron. He was a veteran layout artist originally, and then he got drafted by Tom Wilhite, an executive at the studio in the 70s and early 80s, to be a producer on The Black Cauldron. And we differed about various things creatively on that. But one of the things that he said that I really took to heart was he compared the films that we made and said, these are like tree houses that we're building. And if I could turn my computer around, and it's hooked to too many wires here, but I have a tree house in my backyard that we have a couple of olive trees. They have olive trees in Italy, I know, but there was a perfect space. And then I guess the prior owners used to have a treehouse there. So I built a treehouse for my kids. I have 3 children. But the analogy I thought was that these films are like tree houses in the sense that there's a playful aspect to these animated films that should never be too far away, that they're a source of play and creativity. And one of the things about a tree house is, and it works even with my own treehouse in my backyard, you see the world from a different vantage point. You go there, and even your own backyard, everything is different. You're seeing it from 6 feet higher, and you're seeing your house from a different angle. And you're seeing everything, the tree itself from a different angle, and it gives you a fresh perspective on everything. Combines a sense of adventure and play and a different point of view, and something that awakens what might be you may have gotten used to or numb to or something, and suddenly you see it fresh. And the movie, I think, is like that too, that you build this structure, and it does have structure. Treehouse does have structure. It will fall out of the tree. So it has structure, but it has whimsy built into it. And it has this ability for us as the audience to see things about ourselves and about our families and about our friends, about people we know, fresh and from a different point of view, all under this guise of this kind of adventurous fun, a bit of the unknown, taking something familiar, turning it into something new and engaging. It really is meant to be something that I don't know of anybody practically that can resist a treehouse. You see a treehouse, you want to go up in the treehouse, you're compelled to. And I think the best animated films, even live action films to a certain extent, but particularly animated films, I think have that allure that a treehouse has, that invites you to walk into it, climb up it and experience it, and then enjoy the sort of the vantage that you have there. And that's what animated films are. I've always carried that analogy with me from Joe Hale, and I think it's a good one.
Now we have an existential question. I really love this question. It's from a friend named Francisco Barros. He says, as a master storyteller who has explored timeless themes across diverse cultural narratives, what profound insights or universal truths about the human experience have you uncovered through delving into different traditions and perspectives? What common threads or archetypes seems to resonate universally, transcending cultural boundaries?
Wow, that's such a huge question, and it's a difficult one to answer. I feel part of the success of the films that Ron and I did is that they did tap into some universal themes and ideas. And I think that was intentional. And of course, the irony is, just like with writing, Howard Ashman used to talk about the best writing is specific, not general. The more specific you are, the likelihood is the better the writing is. He talked about that in reference to songs, that he said, I can't write a June Spoon song that just relies on a rhyme and tells a vague romance or something that had no interest in him. He really wanted to get into specifics. So I think, obviously, a lot of Disney films are based on fairy tales, and fairy tales have a universality to them because in a lot of times they really deal with the rite of passage of children becoming adults. And Bruno Bettelheim is an author. I don't know if you've read his work, but he wrote The Uses of Enchantment. And it's a book that talks about how fairy tales are a way for children to process this scary world of passing from the world of childhood to becoming an adult. And it is a big change, and it is a difficult thing to connoiter. And in a way, you're separating yourself from your parent. You've been so attached to your parent, and now you're you're finding your way into this world that can seem daunting or frightening. Fairy tales are a way of helping process that. I don't know if you just said what universal truths have we discovered. I think so many things have to do with trying to get a sense of who am I and why am I here, as of some of the most basic questions. But I think a lot of our films deal with identity, feeling either that I am a fish out of water, literally, like in the case of Little Mermaid, I have ties to another world and I'm outside of. Many of Hans Christian Andersen's stories dealt with that, the outsider looking at another world who feels alien to him. And I would say growing up in my big Irish Catholic family, as you grew up in your big Italian Catholic family, you're a part of it. And yet there can be an element of just, I'm an observer of things. I see the world out there and I feel like I'm not necessarily a part of this or that. And sometimes I want to be a part of that. Sometimes I'm like, no, I'm glad I'm not a part of that. But trying to find your own place in the universe. Why? Where do I fit into the bigger picture of things? And then those challenges that everybody has, whether or not they be trying to validate your own existence. Obviously, there are many stories we've dealt with that deal with romance, why you might connect with a certain person. What is it about them that pulls you into them? And then there's a journey always connected with that, where you fall in love, but there's always obstacles. And that goes back to Shakespeare and everything else, that the course of love never runs smooth. And that's a basic thing that many of these stories tap into. I think all of the stories, characters, I think you have to find a story, and in your story, issues about the character that resonate with yourself, that you have to tap into yourself as both the writer and the subject and the audience. Almost, you're all of those things. So you're really trying to invest a lot of yourself in your own personal feeling. What did it feel to you to be in a situation like this? How did you cope with it? Who are the helpers you had along the way to see you through to the other side? What do these things share? In Little Mermaid, there's a romance story, but the story I think that in some ways was equally compelling was the sort of father-daughter story of the overprotective father and the girl who wanted to be on her own. That's a story that transcends cultures. I think you can find that in just about any culture, because parents and children, there's a primal quality to their relationships. Some of the same things happen around the world, it seems to me, that of people trying, your parents even seeing a role for you that you may not share that idea. And then how do you cope with that conflict? And of course, all stories have conflict. And if a story doesn't have conflict, you don't have much of a story. So there's a writer, Laios Egri. His book, The Art of Dramatic Writing, was recommended to me by, not to me, but I knew that Leonard Starr, who was one of my favorite comic strip cartoonists, who wrote a comic strip called On Stage. And he was one of the best writers. It was a continuity strip. He mentioned as he was getting into writing the strip, that was one of the best books he felt he'd read on just writing. That was about really writing plays, but it certainly applies to screenplays and applies to animation too. But it's a worthwhile book to read for your people if they haven't. It deals with really character as the source of storytelling. And there's a premise that is the theme of your story. All stories have themes and all stories have characters, and you're really trying to find characters that do they clash and how do they resolve those differences. All stories need to have movement. They need to have rising action, and they need to have an arc that they can't just spin in a place. They need to have something that upsets the status quo, and then where is it going to go from there? And I do think that those ideas transcend cultures. I think they aren't limited to an American culture or a European culture or a South American or South Pacific culture. They carry over from culture to culture.
That's beautiful. We now have a question that connects to that. This is from Mel. She's part of our Write for Animation Academy, where we write together, learn about the craft. And she says, they always say, make me care. But how do you make them care? What has been your approach to this personally for your characters?
Yeah, that's the whole, save the cat thing or whatever. But yeah, you want characters that are, I talk about this in what was my 7 C's? I'm trying to remember. Was that in animation? I think that was more in animation, but it applies. And I can't remember what they are. But one of them was that you want characters that are compelling, that basically their issues are strong enough that you really invest yourself emotionally in their journey. And how you do that, I think, again, it falls back to making them relatable. I think you want them to be charismatic, even your villains, and that you want your characters to be somebody who you want them to be on screen. You want to come back to those characters, see what their issues are. And there's a lot of parts to that. I think, obviously, the way they look, the way they speak, their point of view on the world, all those things I think are meant to intrigue and engage us, even if we don't agree with some of those things. My mentors at Disney, the 9 Old Men and those guys, they always talked about appeal. And appeal is a funny word, because it could mean to some people, appeal means cuteness. There should be a cuteness factor. It really goes way beyond that. I think appeal is much more slippery and hard to define. But if your characters don't have some level of appeal, I think it will be hard for your audience to engage with them. But that appeal can come from all sorts of different things. And as I said, I think villains can have appeal too, and they should have some kind of appeal. You shouldn't just be like, you've got to even get us intrigued by their motives, by their actions. An audience, I think, doesn't want to be too far ahead of you. If they're too far ahead of you, that's a problem. So you want to surprise the audience, and yet you can go so far in that direction that then the audience distances itself from the story because they don't understand, why did this person do that? That doesn't seem convincing to me. I don't understand why they took that action. And then you can lose them. And I always talked with Ron, we talked about it, that our movies, and in effect, the stories are a little bit like a train, again, an analogy, and you've got to get the audience on the train with you. And if you don't get them on the train, they don't have to be on the train instantly, but they got to be on the train pretty early. And if you don't get them on that train, you'll never get them on the train. It'll be in the middle of the movie and they have not engaged. They have not committed themselves to the movie. So it's really crucial in the opening quarter of the movie to lay out something that compels them to want to see more and invest themselves in that story. And there's no formula, I would say, for how you do that, but there's many factors that you can tap into. Confronting the character, what is it that they don't have, that they need? Do they know they need something? What they want and what they need isn't always the same thing, and trying to find out what the difference between those two things are and how you play one off the other. And again, just developing the story in a way that, and particularly if you go all the way to the ending of the story, you want an ending that isn't foreseen and yet feels right. That's the challenge of all endings. Michael Arndt has this big thing about Star Wars, about how the ending works so well because there's personal stakes, there's world stakes.
Philosophical stakes.
Right. And so the best stories can deliver on all those things in the climax. And I think his point is well taken. And that's true, that if you can find a story that manages to do all those things at the end, it leaves the audience with such a feeling of satisfaction and of completion, and that they can take something away, and an exhilaration in a way that the story has a lift to it again, and it's not a letdown.
I want to get into your practical process, and we'll get back to the ending because we have a couple of questions about the ending that are very interesting. And so when you have a story beat in mind as a story moment, how do you write a scene? What is your approach? What's the first thing you do when I need to write this scene?
Yeah, Ron Clements and I have an approach that I'll tell you about, and I'm not recommending people use it, but this is what we do. For us, we have, before we write an actual script, we have usually written a treatment, and perhaps we've had a beat board that's actually taken the story and blocked it out visually, say just in 20 drawings. Here are the beats of the story, just to get a sense of the visual play of the story. Certainly when we were writing a script, we were both animators. We try and write with animation in mind, with a visual medium in mind. So in some ways that may mean a little less dialogue and maybe sometimes a little bit more stage directions as we try and create a scene that feels visual and all of that. I've usually written a treatment, and it might be 5 pages, it might be 10 pages. But in that document, we've outlined the story and we've outlined the characters, and we've had certainly discussions about the characters and how they play and what they are. And so when we go about the act of writing, because Ron is particularly good with structure and I'm arguably a little better or just more oriented toward exploration of dialogue and invention and improvisation, it's a little bit like playing the piano a little bit, where Ron is the left hand and I'm the right hand. So we have this outline, and basically I start improvising on paper. We have the outline, and I take the first scene and I go through consecutively through the story, and I improvise on paper, and I may write fragments of a particular scene. I may write the whole scene. I very often write it 10 different ways. I write 10 different versions of that scene because I don't want to censor myself. I want to just see where my mind takes me. I picture the character, and so I get to give a sense of the character's voice, and I'm writing dialogue and description. And I write longhand. I don't really type very well, so I write longhand. And then I feed those pages to Ron, and so he has those. And I move on to the next scene. And Ron, in order to not be interrupted, because Ron is very dedicated and all that, he doesn't share with me what he's doing. He basically takes what I've written, reads it all, circles things he likes, and starts to build the script. He may not like any of those 10 that I've written, and so he may write something wholly new, or he may take half of this one, half of that one, or a big chunk of a certain version, and he starts building the script and continually going back over it as he adds to it, refining it, setting things up, and moving back and forth between scenes. But I'm not reading a word that he's written until he finishes that whole draft. Unless he has an idea that changes the outline of the story in any significant way, I just keep proceeding. And so it may take me 8 weeks to go through the entire script and write all these variations. So the script that ultimately is going to be 100 pages or whatever. We always write too long probably anyway, but I've written 500 pages, really, literally. And finally, when I finish a few weeks ahead of me, he's right behind me usually, and a script where he's made choices on all these things. I read it with a pretty fresh eye. I don't know the choices he's been making. And I say this and it sounds like a joke, but it is true that sometimes I read the script and I'm like, in this scene, why didn't you use my stuff? I feel like you didn't use it anyway. So no, that is yours. And I'm like, It is. I go back there, but yeah, that's right. I did do that. Been so free that I'm non-committal. We've got the superstructure, the scaffolding that we're still hanging everything on. So what I'm doing is changing the scaffolding. But then from that point forward, we go back and forth. So then I read what he's written, the choices he's made, and then I make changes and things, and I give it back to him, and he makes changes, and we do the back and forth period. And then we emerge with our sort of first rough draft of the script. And that's really the process we've done on most of the movies where we've written together. And it's been good in that I think it takes advantage of our strengths. And it's not exclusively that I'm not structured, that Ron's not funny or inventive or whatever. He is. And he's come up with many, like in Little Mermaid. I don't think I'd written the stuff this way, but he came up with the whole intercutting in Little Mermaid when they're at the dinner table and we're cutting back and forth between the chef and the kitchen, and you're back in the table and you come back and forth and all that. That was all Ron's interweaving of those things. I hadn't it that way. We got into production and we were deep into production, and there are various other writers sometimes we bring on who specialize in things. So there was a comedy team that I think our development people said, oh, these guys are good with comedy. We had to recast Scuttle. We had a voice for Scuttle that Jeffrey Katzenberg didn't like, and we liked him. Robert Weil was the name of this actor. He didn't like him. And so he's hired a comedian, Richard Mulligan, to do a voice, and he was a comedian. So you're a lot further along if you get a comic persona from a comedian. So we thought, who would be a funny voice for Siegel? And at least in the American version, it was Buddy Hackett, a very borscht, funny comedian. We met with him. He didn't really audition, but he's got that funny voice, Brooklyn, and the whole thing. Rewrote the character with him in mind somewhat. But we were already into production somewhat. So we had this other team, 3 comedy guys who I think were stand-up comics. And they took Scuttle and they rewrote it in Buddy Hackett's voice. And then we kind of rewrote their writing a little bit. But that helped us make that character specific. And ultimately, it made it a better character that we did that. And I was alluding to in Mermaid also that because we're deep into production, there were a couple of key scenes that Howard Ashman rewrote later where we had story issues that Michael Eisner had complained about, or Jeffrey, but particularly Michael had a few notes that were actually good notes. And so Howard said, let me take a crack at those because we were busy trying to keep animators going and everything. So Michael Eisner had the note when he saw the rough reel that Sebastian was very much the king's ally at the beginning and his emissary. And he was directed, you take care of that girl and keep an eye on her and don't let her get in trouble and all that. And of course, by the end of the movie, he's helping her and he's doing things that would be very contrary to the king. Michael Eisner thought we didn't have a clear enough spot where he went from being adversarial to helpful. Where was that transition? And in the kind of language that Michael and Jeffrey always used, I think his comment was, if you don't fix that, you don't have a movie. That was his comment. It's always black and white, often black and white with those guys. And so it was a little more shady because we had tried to make that transition, but it was a little murky and it was a little ill-defined. So Howard rewrote a couple of scenes, particularly the main scene he rewrote, the scene after she washes up on the beach now having human legs, and the crab is yelling at her, we're going to go straight back to that king, and don't you give me that, you're going to do this, and you're going to be miserable for the rest of your life. And she gives him a very moony, sad, wistful look. He said, all right, I'll help you find that prince. What a soft shell I'm turning out to be. That was Howard's scene, and that helped. And then he had some clearer things where the crab was her advocate now in the scene where she's going to sleep. He's saying, you've got to bat your eyes like this, you pucker up your lips like this. Howard wrote that stuff, which was a more explicit thing, because I think maybe it was a little murkier in our version that he was now on her side and trying to move things along in that direction. So those were helpful things. And then he argued with our ending, and it was a good writerly point he made, because we used to have when the prince was on the beach and Ariel was on the rock watching him wistfully at the very end, and the king is watching them, and the king had a line, some versions maybe where they hardly said anything. And Howard comes from the world of theater. He's like, people talk. They don't just stand there, because we were more on the movie end, like people should talk less. So there was a push-pull between us and Howard, because he's like, you don't have a dramatic thing and not have dialogue. So anyway, so when we did have dialogue, though, then we gave the king a line where he said, that human saved my life, before he turns, Ariel gives her human legs. I brought around by his, if he didn't intervene, I would be dead. And Howard's, you've written the wrong ending for your movie. He said, you have a movie that's about a father-daughter relationship and a daughter wanting to get independence from her father. If you're doing a movie about prejudice, that's the ending for that movie. But this hasn't really been that movie. And he was right. And so he wrote the scene. And what was great was he did what the best writing does, obviously, that you can use subtext and not be OTN on the nose, and yet you still get it. So he rewrote the scene between Triton and the crab at the end, where he says, she really does love him, doesn't she, Sebastian? And then Sebastian says, well, like I always say, children have to be free to lead their own lives. King looks at, you always say that? He said, hey. And then the king says, well, I guess there's just one problem left. I says, what? And he says, how much I'm going to miss her. And then he turns her into a human. And so how much I'm going to miss her doesn't say it on the nose, but basically that says, I'm going to do something that changes my mind, tips the whole thing the other way, and yet doesn't say it explicitly. And then it's the action that says it when he actually, there he goes, and he turns her. So that was a great bit of writing by Howard, I think, that really helped wrap up that father-daughter story in an emotional way. And it was a learning moment for us in terms of making sure your endings fit your beginnings. And I think Moana, we went through a slightly similar process where we struggled with the third act of the movie. And finally, some things fell into place in a way that I'm really happy with. It came from multiple sources from a writing point of view, including Lin-Manuel Miranda, Mark Mancina. Different strands came together in a way that, yes, that's satisfying. All these different endings. And finally, we have one that really feels like we'll get into endings later.
We had Jared Bush from Moana on the show, and he talked about Moana and then later Encanto and how the musical of the first song. Very interesting interview as well. So now we have a question from Mike Jones. He's a co-writer of Soul and Luca at Pixar, and he's one of the main writers at the studio, and he's always there to also help on other projects. And after the interview, I told him that I was going to have the honor to chat with you. So I asked him for a question. He says, what is your process for working second act story problems?
Yeah, the second act is a challenge. I don't think we have a system, really. We didn't have a system. You use story reels. There's the script, and then there's the story reel, and that is really a version of the script. And you put it in front of an audience, and that can help tell you. And the audience, I'm saying, is just in-house. It's people from the staff, but you can get a sense of where things may go awry. Has the rising action stopped rising in the middle act? Or has the story somehow run out of steam? You had the fun of the characters' introductions, and you've introduced the problem, say, at the end of Act 1 of where we're going. But then there's a journey through Act 2 that's got to lead you to that sort of ultimate end of Act 2 sort of climactic moment the story's going to hinge on. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a system, except that obviously we used the Pixarian system, which can be brutal, but after a screening of trying to discuss different options for how it works. When we're writing, Ron and I have a dialectic when we're going about the story, but I don't think we ever arrived at, here's the miracle way of fixing Act 2 problems. Many stories have Act 2 issues, and I don't think they're always the same. I think they're often different, but each story, I think, can have its own challenges. So I just think getting a fresh eye on it is one of the most helpful. Trying to get somebody outside the story who can look at it more objectively than you can, because it's just easy to lose your way in any of these things. You're just so close to the material that it helps to bring in and have someone read your script, or if you've got the reel, show them the reel, and they may look at something that seems obvious to them, but it isn't to you because you're seeing it through a different lens.
Act 2 is tough. If you're struggling, maybe you need someone else to help you spot what's missing. That's exactly what the Write for Animation Academy is here for. Join today at writeforanimation.com/academy and become part of a community of passionate storytellers where we help each other take our careers to the next level. I can't wait to see you in our next session and introduce you to everyone. Now, let's go back to John Musker.
And you mentioned Michael Ern. He told me you should ask every guest this question.
It's going to be a hard question. I know it is.
It's hard. It's about hard things. What was the hardest story problem you faced in a film, and what have you learned from solving it? So you can pick any production you worked on. But what was something very hard, not because of the studio or notes, but as a writer, like I cannot figure this out.
Yeah, boy, I don't know. It's like any of these things where they say, what is your favorite film?
It's not easy.
They're all hard. I don't know. It's hard for me trying to go through the catalog of films right now in my head, thinking like on each film, if I had to say, what was the hardest problem on that film? Certainly, we often have a problem just with length and that we write too long. They tend to budget almost by the minute or whatever. There's a thing, or they evaluate it that way. So, hey, you have to somehow cut 10 minutes out of this or 15 minutes out of this. And for us, it's a challenge. And we've, I think, made some mistakes where we, like in the case of the movie Hercules, Ron still has his regrets about that. And that we, rather than taking like a whole sequence out or a couple of sequences out to get it to the right length, we just squished the whole movie. Initially, we had a much longer thing. We did cut out entire sequences. There was a whole thing where Hercules battled the Nemean lion, and then his stepfather Amphitryon was mortally wounded during this attack. And on his deathbed, he told Hercules, "I'm your stepfather. I'm not your real father, and you've got to go find your real father." And he sent him off on his mission. In a way, it prefigured the Ramatala in Moana, sending her out. But then the movie was too long. So we wound up cutting that whole thing because we really had a big chunk we had to remove from the movie. So in some ways, one of our biggest problems has just been length and making the story work for the length that we're given, and trying to find how do you really know what you can most safely remove. And so I think it's a Jenga-like thing, finding which pieces can be removed without destroying the movie. I think that's certainly one of the biggest. Treasure Planet had a very tough time with, that's the other thing that comes into these things. You come out of a preview. The previews go well, obviously, then you're just trying to embellish and enhance what's there. But if the previews don't go well, then all hell can break loose. And so we hadn't had a good preview. We had a bad preview, and it was right around 9/11. And so that may have colored it even a little bit. We're telling a story where armed people take over a vessel that had a different resonance when we were previewing it in 2001 than it had when we were working. Yeah. But there are other things too. The character of Jim Hawkins in that movie, we wanted him to be a troubled youth who grew up without a father and needed a guy who really needed a father. And Long John Silver becomes this unlikely surrogate father. But how do we introduce Jim? How do we get us on his side, particularly if he is a sullen teenager? Those aren't the most likable people in the world. They're people that you're like, shut up, you're annoying me, and you're too self-absorbed. So we wound up, because in the preview, the audience hadn't clicked with his character well enough, it seemed like. And again, we were also just naive. It's a tough challenge with Disney features because the challenge is to get fathers into the audience, and to a lesser extent to get boys in the audience. But fathers definitely are in that demographic of men, women, boys, girls. Men are the hardest ones, I would say, to get to come to the thing. Of course, we're telling a story that is not a romance. It was an action adventure. It was not a musical. And we were sitting there as we were watching the audience file in for the preview, and it was just one after another. A mother and her little daughter. This is not going to go well. And then it didn't go well. So we have been fighting an upstream battle anyway. But we ultimately wound up restructuring the opening, partly based on what I was suggesting, which was we tried to give Jim a moment of exhilaration before coming down so you could see him being happy about something before he sank into his depression almost. And I think we had a different way of putting over the idea that he was a fatherless kid. And we used to have a scene where he saw a father, and we saw a little kid who needed help with some kind of scooter or something like that. And Jim went to help him, but his dad was there, and I got this, and he took care of it. And Jim saw this very wistfully. Here's a father and son really connecting in this father-son moment. And we had that for a while. And then because of these story changes we made, that scene went away. And Ron has always regretted us making that choice. He feels like we made the wrong choice, that there was a way we could have done it where we could have kept that scene and you would have gotten with Jim more emotionally by keeping it. And I think I was on the other side of that one, just feeling, let's do this other way where we just get him going. And I think Ron didn't argue as vociferously as he did after the fact, then when he felt like, in hindsight, that was a mistake. I would say that was a challenge from a story point, is getting with a character who has arguably, if not unlikable characteristics, but the characteristics can be either off-putting or keeping you to remove. Now, of course, I travel to all these festivals with my short film and I meet these 20-year-old kids and I teach a little bit. And Treasure Planet is their favorite movie.
Was rewatching the first act with my daughter, was also thinking the same. I think that it's a wonderful balance that you really feel for the protagonist. And I love that scene. I'm very glad that it got to resonate with that younger generation.
Yeah, it's really been gratifying for me to hear this, because I remember when the film came out and Michael Eisner literally wrote off the film after the opening weekend. He was quarreling with Roy Disney and he was eager to lay its diminished box office at Roy's door to discredit Roy so that he wouldn't be his adversary in these courtroom board of directors meetings or whatever. And that, but Ron was off skiing that weekend and I had to take the brunt of its box office disappointment. And it was a very tough weekend for us. We had been spoiled by all these other films. Even when they were lesser successes, they were still to a certain degree. And this was like, you're writing it off and everything. And phone calls of condolences, which are always a mixed bag because you're glad to hear from people, but you feel horrible. And even with Jeffrey Katzenberg, I talked to him the week after and he's like, okay, you got to get back on the horse. He was actually in his own crazy Jeffrey way. Nice to hear. I'm going to take it as sincere, even if it wasn't, because it was heartening in a way. It was an interesting experience though. Yeah, but I am glad now that I'm hearing. So you always on these movies, you have something in your head you're trying to communicate, whether or not about the audience, about the character and the story. And we're not making art movies that like, I don't care if anybody gets it. If I get it, that's enough. No, I'm trying to make a movie that connects with an audience and it's a mass entertainment. And if it doesn't connect with them, then we have failed. I know even Brad, he made the movie Tomorrowland, and I think he still feels like somehow it's going to be discovered later on. But I'd say there may be problems in the movie that Brad's not totally sensitive to. But I know he had some previews or something, which I remember him describing to me that the notes that came out of those previews, he described as head scratchers. And they went through a period of reshooting and recutting and really having to do all sorts of stuff. And the movie feels like that kind of. But Brad, in his own writing, obviously, he's always like, I'm writing a certain way, and I think it's going to move the audience in a certain direction. As with Spielberg directing a movie, I'm directing this movie in a way that I think will move an audience in a certain direction. And I think the audience wasn't moving at all in the direction Brad was trying to direct them into. And he was bewildered, or at least just puzzled by how they could be their response was so different than what he thought it was going to be, because he was so good in so many of his other films of reading an audience or anticipating an audience or knowing how to dangle something in front of them and engage them. And then this didn't go that way.
Another question that we get a lot, and we recently released a video with Brenda Chapman and Mike Jones from Pixar and a couple of newcomers, directors, Kayla Emerson and McKenna Harris, also from Sony and Pixar, and all about dialogue. Anyway, that is something that I struggle with, and many writers struggle with as well. You were telling us before that in the duo, you're more of the dialogue guide
I'm
guy as
more
well,
of the
right?
dialogue
And
guy,
I'd love
right?
to hear your approach to dialogue.
And one of the things that Howard Ashman said was, and do I do it? Not that much, but I think it's a good idea, is when you write dialogue is to speak the dialogue, to actually not just write it, but actually say it and hear it said. Even as we were doing rewrites with the writer, we would have meetings with like our head of story and say like Rob Edwards, who might be writing on Princess and the Frog, and me and Ron. This is in preparation for recording sessions, and so we would be going into those sessions. So we'd be taking a few scenes we knew we were going to record and really sort of working them over a little bit in terms of the dialogue and creating alternates. I mean, that's the thing in animation. We often would write alternate dialogue because in the big picture of things, at least for us at the Disney system, recording time is not that hugely expensive and it is an improvisational medium. So I think we often, when we record a voice, we record it as written, but then we would encourage the actors. I know you have a director, say like Billy Wilder, who was like, I want a comma there, I want a comma there. And I don't want you giving me other words. I'm a writer. Every word has meaning. It's easier for us as directors when we've written the script to be able to say to people, now you know the intent of the scene, kind of have fun with it. That was foreign to Howard too, I would say, because Howard came from a world of theater and was leery of giving actors that control or everything. But of course, the truth is the actors don't have that control because you still have an editing room later and you're going to make choices. But I think a lot of good things came out of that system. But I would say even in writing, as I described it before, I've done a little bit of acting and high school theatrical type things and that sort of thing. But I really do try and become the character, and I write the dialogue. And of course, if you have a dialogue that it helps, and I'm a caricaturist too. And I think there's somebody like Charles Dickens, but I think dialogue and writes characters. And I think Dickens is a caricaturist too. He finds ways of particularizing, making characters different from each other by the way they speak, by certain turns of phrase, whether or not they use longer sentences, they use shorter bursts, they have certain things they come back to. I think that's what we would try to discover. And often it would help us with dialogue to picture a certain actor saying those lines, even if we didn't think that actor would necessarily ultimately do the part. We might have that character in our head. So when I was writing Ursula's stuff, and Ron disagrees because he had a different voice in his head, because he definitely pictured B. Arthur, who was very sardonic comedian, and she had the low voice. That's probably why I pictured B. Arthur, because she was sarcastic but spoke in a low register, which we always felt like for the witch we wanted her to contrast with Ariel's soprano, so that when she took her voice, it would be a very marked difference. But in talking with Howard in the early going, and I think I had this thought even before we talked to Howard, but Howard was amused in our treatment when he saw the dynamic between Ursula and Triton. And his big thing at that time was, it's like Dynasty, like the TV soap Dynasty. And like she's Joan Collins and da-da-da-da and all this. And so when I wrote the dialogue for Ursula, I was picturing Joan Collins saying it. Kind of. And so there's just a vampy quality that Joan Collins had, a very catty, vampy, funny, diva approach. And so that would be resonating in my head a little bit. So I would play a scene in my head with her saying it and write it as I heard her speak it, that sort of thing. So I think, looking for the difference in textures and choices between two characters and finding contrast, I think that can help give the dialogue sort of a lift and a spark. And then I do think what I was doing was trying to improvise on paper. So something might take a left turn, and then you got to work with that. And that can lead to some interesting discoveries. So I think if you can free yourself while writing to not worry about writing the perfect scene, but try and write for the character and explore different things about the character and don't edit too much initially and give yourself some raw material to sift back through and see where there's certain things that may just pop out more like, oh yeah, that's really particular or sharp or whatever. Like in Little Mermaid, then Ron had like some of the lines like where she threw back at Sebastian when he was like, when she was leaving to go see the witch and he was trying to stop her. And she's like, why don't you go tell my father? You're good at that. And that was Ron's line. And that was a perfect line. I heard it in my youth. I feel like, it was sister saying that. And it was a very simple, direct thing, but very relatable, very identifiable and to the point and like, and just cut to the chase. It's great when you can find just simple things like that lock in a character, however general they are, that they have some little specific thing that you go, oh yeah, I've heard there. That resonates with me. I can relate to that.
I was very curious when I listened. Do you bring them in a separate document as a director? Then you can also use them in the recording room? Is that something you do, or do you have your script?
Yeah, we have a recording script that reads as a script that does the alternates almost like we sort of had them on a separate page, but yet would always put enough context so you understood what they were there for. So if you needed still to get a lead into it and a setup or whatever, that might also be repeated. Mm-hmm. Also, I think we would highlight the lines, I think, and I don't know if we highlighted the alternates. I guess we might have. But definitely when we went through the script with the actors recording, we would generally do the scenes a few times and with no alternates. I mean, we just read the scenes. There was sort of an A choice, and that was the one that was in the scene was really the top choice. But then we would go through separately almost, okay, now let's go back into some of these alternatives. Or the improv version, where we can kind of be freer with this if you want to. Some actors are comfortable with that, some are not. We had one, in fact, he was so uncomfortable with it that we wound up not using it because on the character of Hades for Hercules, we had written it with Jack Nicholson in mind, and then we met with him, and we couldn't make a deal with him. And of course, the movie would have been twice as long if we'd had Jack, because he would just very slowly. And so we got James Woods, hey, man, what do you know? Talks at least twice as fast. So, certain actors won't audition. So, you have to cast them not having heard them say the line. So in this case, the actor that our animator liked the best was John Lithgow, who would not audition. So we hired John Lithgow. And after already having auditioned James Woods, and it was such a different take, but we loved it. We thought it was funny. So we cut it into our story reel, even though we weren't necessarily thinking we were going to use him. Then we hired John Lithgow. Then he records. And we've been so spoiled by James Woods' improvs. And we go to John Lithgow and we say, now you can kind of improvise. He's like, well, I don't really do improv. I don't do that. And I'm not comfortable with that. We said, that's fine. You don't have to worry. Inside, we're dying because it sounds kind of flat. And it's like, that was our emergency escape hatch, that James Woods gave. We don't have now. So, and then ultimately we realized, and some people were saying, why aren't you using James Woods? And we had to admit, yeah, it would be funnier. It would be better. And he can do this stuff. So we bought off John Lithgow, much to his agent. Wait a minute, you're firing John Lithgow? We're not firing. We're moving in a different direction. Yeah, but we were really happy with James Woods and what he did. Yeah.
John, I would keep talking the third day. This is fantastic. I just, if you have just a couple more minutes.
Okay.
I just don't want to miss out on I'm Hip and your experiences. So I'd like to close with that. It's fantastic. And we have a question related to that, but you can expand on anything you want to share about writing and creating this wonderful piece. What is the difference between writing for a short film like I'm Hip and a feature film? This is from Darshan, also from our Right Variation Academy.
In some ways, I'm Hip was almost like I was storyboarding a song from one of our features, because it was all a song. The song was written, the lyric was there. In effect, there was sort of a story outlined in the song, but not really. I mean, it was really like, what kind of story could I turn it into? And I liked the basic story of funny commentary on people who are so desperate to be on the cutting edge of things. Again, I've seen these people all my life, and I always am amused by them because I'm one of the least hip people I know, if not the least hip person I know. So it amuses me to be in the company of a hipster who I both feel kind of like I want to tease, and yet I envy in a way, because, they're kind of cool, and they're doing these things. They're kind of cool. I would be such a poser to do any of those things, and yet it's natural to them. But they deserve to be made fun of, sort of. So, so I had this song that I had heard 30 years ago. I had to make several, just sort of story choices. I mean, I felt like it was a presentational song, so I thought, person singing the song, we should follow them through a series of vignettes that explore the lyric of the song. And then early on, I was trying to decide: is it going to be a person, or could it possibly be a cartoon character, some kind of animal? And I did some drawings of a person, and I did some drawings of a cat. And a cat just seemed like it would be more fun to animate. And I like the surrealism of dropping a cat into a human world with no explanation. I mean, it's Bugs Bunny. It's, the cartoon convention. And a cat, just in terms of different animals, some people say, why did you make him a dog? But a cat innately seems just kind of cooler to me. When I hear Dave Frischberg's voice, who sang that song, it feels like a cat. So, but I had to write a visual story a little bit. I wanted to create an arc for the story. And the song has, like many songs, it can have verses, choruses, a bridge, and then a final chorus. So there are structures within songs, as there are structures within stories. And so I thought this song did have a structure, and that it had this bridge where he got very recitative, and he did this whole thing. Now I'm deep into Zen. And so it kind of quiets down, and he's more reflective. And then when the song picks up again, the rhythm section comes back in, and it's up tempo. And then he had a funny sort of coda to the song that he made that helped the structure, in that at the end, he just had these repeated, I'm hip, I'm hip, I'm hip, which was just a funny ending. And so there are various things in the story that gave me ideas for visuals. So certainly at the ending, I felt like his discordant vocal suggested to me, because I had a cat in the story, that he should be a cat in a back alley kind of wailing, because I hear them outside my own house at night, and all that. And I thought, he's doing this and he's waking up the neighborhood, and there's an apartment building with lights going on. And I just thought that seemed like it would go with it. And his repeated things, though, there's a piano sort of cascade in between those I'm hip. So he goes, I'm hip, I'm hip, and I just felt like when I heard this, I felt like, yeah, that seems like falling objects to me. So I thought that gave me the sort of story, the visualization of, yeah, he's trying to do this. And people are throwing bigger and bigger objects in Tex Avery fashion. They're getting bigger and funnier. That's the intent anyway. And finally, he's going to have a comic bash that we iris out on him in some fashion. Likewise, earlier in the story, there was a thing that Dave sang where he sang in a very low register and he goes, blah, 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 blah. And I just thought, why would he, I love that weird singing he's doing. Is there some visual justification story-wise that I can do for that? And I thought, well, if the cat was underwater, he might sing that way. And then I thought, how do I get the cat underwater? And I thought, well, what if there's an altercation at some jazz club that's at an open-air rooftop jazz club, such that he gets thrown out of the jazz club, and it's like the Hudson River is right next to him, and he falls in the river, and then he has a confrontation with these sea creatures under there, and then there was an arpeggio in the music. And I thought that seems perfect for that he would tug on a fishing line. There's a fisherman who does that and extracts him and pulls him up to a dock. It all felt like it was in the music. So I was prompted by the music almost. The story grew out of the lyrics or the way the music worked into it. And I did create options in this. So I did sort of notes. I did write notes for myself, but then I just I storyboarded the whole thing myself. And I did very crudely because I didn't have to go through conventional means of selling it to a producer or a studio, because it was only me and my collaborators. So it was a very scratchily drawn storyboard, but I did shot a story reel and did variations. I showed it to a couple of people and I made some changes based on that, but there was never a script for it necessarily. So it was really a storyboard that existed. Now I'm thinking of, I have a few other ideas I'm exploring now as a possible another film. And among the ideas I'm exploring, there's a couple that have no lyrics. They're completely instrumental. Yeah. So those are very, I mean, you could do 50 different stories with this particular piece of music. I have been doing some writing on those, but I've been writing in an exploratory way, in a general way, again, almost like improvising on paper, where I'm just like, this could happen. Maybe I should start with this. If I finish with this, I think it might be fun to end this way. This character could have this moment in the middle, this could happen this way, or it could go this way. So I have yet to do a drawing on it, but I'm sort of doing written explorations of it that I'm now going to go off, explore visually. I know Vance Garrett used to advocate this for the traditional way Disney features were done, traditional, but certainly in the 40s and 50s sometimes, and that they would have visual artists exploring a story before there was anything written, and doing tableaus of scenes. So I'm in some ways, what I'm doing right now is that I'm writing things that are tableaus that I'm going to draw up and see which ones spark me the most, or lead from this to that, or that's too much like that. So if I do that, I'm not going to do that. But really just having fun with pictorial tableau type storytelling moments that I'm like, yeah, that has something to it that will really, I think, connect. So that is, at least on a couple of these, is what I'm going to do. And then we'll see if when I put it all together, if I like what's there, if it feels like it fits the music, I will try then to structure it and lay some of it against the music to see where certain things fit and all that. So it's going to be a pretty organic process, I think.
That's fantastic to hear that. It's kind of a Fantasia approach. It
is kind of Fantasia. So really, I showed I'm Hip at Annecy last year, and it was subtitled, for the French audiences. And it's got such quick cutting anyway. And to see these subtitles going by, if you're trying to read those and look at the film. So that has helped in some ways prompt me in this direction. Also, just wanting to do something a little bit different. So one of the ideas, getting into more acting, it was a comedy, fun short, I'm Hip. And it didn't rely on performance stuff so much. It was a more theatrical performance. But some of the other ideas are maybe more traditional, that I really have a character playing off another one. There's a relationship and they have to do things. And how can I still exploit animation to do it in a way that's pointed and visual and engaging and compelling and all that? I'm leaning toward one of my ideas that is more Fantasia. Like there's two of my ideas are in that sort of Fantasia realm, and one's more complicated than the other. And of those two, the simpler one is sort of the one that I'm leaning toward. And yet it's simple, but again, the story could be this, it could be that, but I have a general idea of where I'm thinking it's going.
That's fantastic. I cannot wait to hear more about that. Also, because maybe we'll get to do a part 2. I have so many questions left, and this has been a masterclass for me. It's fantastic. You're so generous with your time and also knowledge.
Thank you so much, John. The Little Mermaid was the first film I watched on the big screen, and it was surreal to get to learn from you. Another amazing artist who inspires me and can teach you a lot is Chris Sanders. He's the brilliant mind behind Lilo and Stitch, How to Train Your Dragon, and The Wild Robot. Click on this video to discover his creative process and learn how to create characters that truly connect with your audience. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. I'm screenwriter Pietro Schito, and this is Right for Animation. I'll see you in the video.